And we are live. What's up, guys? Welcome to Fresh Air Podcast, man. Today we're going to be talking about the assassination of John F. Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963. We got a lot to talk about. I'm really excited for this one. Let's get into it. Let's go. Yo, and we are live. What's up, guys? Welcome to Fresh Air Podcast, man. Today is Friday, but we got a special guest in the house. We got Cory Hughes in the house. We're going to be talking about John F. Kennedy, and it's interesting that we're talking about this because Trump literally just said, I think earlier today or yesterday, that he's going to declassify a good portion of the documents, but we're going to go ahead and give you guys a preview of what he's going to declassify because we already know who was behind this. We know why it happened, and we know who the shooters were that pulled the triggers on that fateful day, and hint, it wasn't Oswald, and we're going to talk about that in detail. He is the author of the book, it's Warning From Hsitory. Cory Hughes has been researching this for a while. I'm going to have him introduce himself to you guys. I'm really excited to have him on the pod. Let's go ahead. Cory, you there?
Yes.
Hey, what's up, man? I know who you are. Obviously, author. You've talked about this, probably one of the best, if not the best, Kennedy researcher in the world. You have extensive knowledge on this, but you know what? I'll just turn it to you. Can you introduce yourself to the people and tell them about how long you've been doing this, how you did this, what motivated you to do it, etc.?
Sure. My name's Cory Hughes. I'm a former police officer turned historian. I began my research career back in 2014, 2015, and by July of 2018, I started Kennedy research full-time for the most part. And that's pretty much it. I do a podcast, a daily podcast on Kennedy called Cory Hughes Bloody History. And I have a Substack called bloodyhistory.substack.com where I address a lot of the issues of World War II. So history has really become my life over the last 10 years or so. And that has brought me right here.
Yeah. So you're like an encyclopedia. And I want to warn the audience, guys, what we're going to get into is extremely complex. You're going to hear some things that you've never heard before, but we do have a presentation that we're going to be sharing with you guys. The things that we're going to be talking about, this is beyond the, because a lot of people say, oh, conspiracy theory, etc. No, we have facts, we have documents to prove what we're talking about, declassified documents, etc. And here's his book, by the way, Warning From Hsitory, where he goes into excruciating detail as to who was involved and why Kennedy was killed. And I've noticed that a lot of people cover different aspects of this, whether it's the official narrative or it's the, the executive order 111, whatever as they would say. There's a multitude of different reasons why this went down. And I would say that this is probably the most famous and the biggest assassination in American history. If Kennedy wasn't killed on that day, we would be living in a significantly different world. So I think it's very important to understand the history and understand what went down here. Real quick, Cory, so I guess what we're thinking about going first is we'll go over the official narrative. For those that might not understand this, we're going to go over the official narrative that was given to us off of the Warren Commission. And if you can explain to the audience what the Warren Commission is and what the official narrative is in general.
Sure. So the Warren Commission, after Kennedy was killed, the Congress was going to conduct an investigation. But if Congress would have conducted an investigation, it would have been broad-reaching, and they would have had subpoena power, and it would have uncovered a lot of facts that they really wanted to keep under wraps. So Lyndon Johnson basically hijacked the investigative process and assigned Justice Warren, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, to head up this investigation. And the investigation was really nothing more than a cover-up. Going back to the Bay of Pigs, which was a somewhat invasion of Cuba, there was a lot of tension between Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA for the most part, and John F. Kennedy. And Kennedy fired Dulles. Lyndon Johnson thought that he would be the best person to head up this investigation, which should give you a lot of insight into the direction they wanted to take it in the first place. So ultimately, the Warren Commission is what gives us the official story. And the official story is that a man named Lee Harvey Oswald, who was 24 years of age at the time, was a man who had defected to the Soviet Union, was disgruntled with the American way of life, and because of his angst, decided on November 22nd, 1963, to shoot John F. Kennedy from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository in downtown Dallas. That is the gist of the official story, and it sounds and makes a lot of sense if you just leave it there. But as soon as you start to...
If I can add, I was going to just say, and then also, guys, understand that they're saying that he was a lone shooter and he only fired 3 shots from a Kharkov rifle?
Right, so it's a Mannlicher Carcano. So it's an Italian rifle, and it's really, the model was from 1945. It was really junk. But that's kind of irrelevant because, as you'll see, the rifle itself ends up being nothing more than a prop. Just like many of the pieces of evidence that were used to convict Oswald in the mind of the public.
Okay. So, sorry, go ahead and continue on. Anything else you want to add?
Well, yes. As we'll see as we go through this, the official story was meant to not only deflect attention away from the people who were really behind it, but really meant to cover up some of the other things that were going on in the era, some of the relationships that the CIA had been forming and some of the activities that the CIA had been engaged with. So the Warren Commission really solved a lot of problems for the CIA in particular, who were able to then classify a lot of documents that really had nothing to do with Kennedy under the Kennedy umbrella and thus hide them forever. So,
yeah. And I think and obviously Trump talked about this today. What are your thoughts on Trump talking about, literally, I think the news broke this morning, how he said if he's reelected, one of the first things he's going to do is declassify a portion of documents. I don't know if that means he's going to declassify the rest of them or if he's going to declassify another big portion like he did back in, I want to say, like 2017 or 2018. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I've looked at the list of what they're withholding, and honestly, I don't think most of it is relevant to anything. You're definitely not going to find any smoking guns. There is no document that says this person pulled a trigger. What I think you're going to find in the documents is you're going to find that certain relationships existed between people who should not have had relationships with each other. I think that's what you're going to find, because the study of the assassination is the study of relationships. Really, you can look at all of the evidence in the world, and there's a way to have a spin on all of it. But the thing that you really can't deny is when people know each other and engage in activities with each other who shouldn't know each other, like people who work for the CIA and people with the mafia, right? Those are two groups who shouldn't have any interaction with each other, but they do, especially in 1963, right? And that can be very embarrassing for the federal government. So I think a lot of the documents that they're withholding really just highlight relationships that shouldn't have existed at the time.
Gotcha.
Other than that, there are going to be a couple. Files, particularly as one file that I'm excited for. Hopefully, if we ever get it, on a guy named David Morales. David Morales is a very well-known CIA spook who basically was known within the agency for being willing to pick up any task that other people were too nauseated by. He would do pretty much anything, and he gained quite a reputation from that. And I'm anxious to see his file. His file in its entirety is on the top of the list of files that are being withheld. So I don't think we'll ever actually get it.
Okay, so I have a question for you here. According to the official narrative, why did Oswald kill JFK, according to the official narrative, allegedly?
Honestly, I can't tell you. I don't know. They don't know. The story doesn't make sense. Everyone in the country who hated Kennedy were ultra right-wingers. And when you really get into the weeds on some of these players in the background, you'll find that in the late 50s and the early 60s, there was a huge contingent of ultra right-wing, borderline Nazi types in the country who actively talked about killing Kennedy. But Lee Harvey Oswald is allegedly a communist. And so the reason that the right wingers hated Kennedy because he was soft on communism, or so they thought. They thought he was a lefty, right?
Yeah.
And so it doesn't really make any sense that Oswald would want to kill Kennedy. And there's never been an explanation put forth that would give any credence to Lee Harvey Oswald pulling the trigger.
I'm really glad you mentioned that. It's a fantastic point, because for the people out there, right, according to the official narrative, Oswald was a spy. He was in the Marine Corps, and then he defected and went to Russia and lived there for a few years and brought back a Russian woman, and he was a spy and he betrayed his country. But Kennedy was in the process of trying to make peace with Cuba and with Russia, etc., and these communists. And you're right, the right wing absolutely hated him for it. So it wouldn't make sense how someone who is a communist, or he would call himself a Marxist, is what he'd like to use.
A Marxist-Leninist,
yeah,
right?
He didn't like the term communist, but
you could tell he was using words he didn't understand.
Exactly. Like when I remember they had him on an interview in New Orleans or something. He was in a debate, and they said, "Hey, you're a communist." He said, "No, I'm a Marxist-Leninist." But regardless of what he wants to describe himself as, it would be counterproductive for him to kill a U.S. president that actually wanted to make peace with the very people that he aligned himself with. So that's a good point that you mentioned that.
Yeah.
So the official narrative, you guys can already see that there's holes in it. Obviously, they have the magic bullet theory as well. Do you want to cover that real quick in the official narrative?
Sure. So the magic bullet theory, in order to make the assassination work with Lee Harvey Oswald as the lone assassin, meaning he did it by himself without anyone else helping him, allegedly, there were 3 bullets that were fired from the 6th floor window. The first one allegedly hits Kennedy in the back, then goes through Connolly, enters Connolly's right wrist, and then his left leg. It caused 7 or 8 injuries to 2 men. And then the bullet turns up on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital, completely unscathed.
In your presentation, by chance, of the bullet trajectory from the thing from the official narrative? If not, I could pull one up.
No, I don't have that, but it is a straight line from, if you look at where the 6th floor window was, and you look at where the shot from the curb was, you can tell that the shot would not have come from there, because if Lee Harvey Oswald was shooting at a car, where the shot hit the curb, the one that missed, he would have had to have grossly put the rifle in a different direction. It's not plausible. Ultimately, I believe the shot from the rear came from the Daltex building, but we'll get to that later on.
Yeah.
But the magic bullet theory is very complex, and when you get into the nitty-gritty on it, what you'll find is that the FBI switched the bullet. The original bullet that was located that day was not the bullet that they say they found. The original bullet was a pointed tip .303 round, most likely fired from an Enfield .303. But somewhere in the months after the assassination, the bullet magically transforms into a 6.5 Carcano round. And there's plenty of documentation on that.
And the other interesting thing is that one bullet caused 7 wounds, which I think people really need to kind of take that in a bit. Like 7 wounds with one bullet is a little weird. Now, I know the official narrative people, right? They get mad and they say, "Oh, well, you conspiracy theorists try to disprove the magic bullet theory, blah blah blah," because what they allege is, so if I'm Kennedy, right? I'm sitting in the. Do we have the picture up by chance?
1 second.
Okay, we're gonna pull it up here. So just for the audience, so they understand this, right? So Kennedy was sitting behind the governor of Texas, Connolly, right? And the way Kennedy was situated, if you guys could put me on camera 1 real fast. Matter of fact, you know what? Fuck it. We'll do a demonstration here in the studio so that people understand this. Gary, can you do me a huge solid, bro? Can you take that chair and sit it right here? We're going to show you guys literally what it looked like, right? So, because I really want the people to understand this. So, he's going to be Connolly. I'm going to be John F. Kennedy, right? So, take a seat right here. So, this is what they allege, right? So, I'm Kennedy. I'm sitting in the back. The bullet comes from back over here, and in the official narrative, they said that originally they said it was a magic bullet, if I'm not mistaken, and the bullet went this way and then did an S curve and then went into the governor, correct? With this this photo that I have here. But what a lot of historians have said is that Kennedy wasn't actually directly behind the governor. He was to the side, like this, because you can see his arm hanging over the limousine. If we could pull that picture up real quick in the motorcade. No, not this one. The other one where the other one, right? So they're saying that Kennedy was actually off to the side and behind him like this, which is why you can see his arm is over the side, and then the governor's hand is like this. So he was pushed this way, and then they said, okay, if you put it this way, then it actually makes sense. And I know the car right now, if I'm not mistaken, is limousine. It's out in a museum in Detroit. Corey, correct me if I'm wrong. So they said now the bullet theory
That's
works
correct.
because it went from Kennedy's back through his throat, allegedly, from this again, guys, we're going over the official narrative. We're going to talk about the real shit soon. Through his throat, into the governor's back like this, through his chest, and then it hits his wrist, right? And then it goes into his left thigh. Right? That's the official thing. So first people thought it was crazy because Kennedy was sitting behind him. It's like, how the hell is it going to go from here and then make an S curve and then go into him? They're saying, no, he actually sat this way. So it went in and then it would make sense more with the trajectory to go through his back and then it hit his wrist while simultaneously hitting the knee. So
if that had actually happened and he was shot in the back and it happened the way that we were told, I believe that he would have buckled over forward. The idea that it came out his throat and then was able to go into Governor Connally, to me, is quite ridiculous. And as we shall see, that first shot where Kennedy is struck in the throat came from the grassy knoll.
Yeah.
So
so chat, does that make sense what I just demonstrated? That's from the official narrative what they said. At first they were saying he was directly behind him. Then they said, no, actually he's tilted to the side. Because I think it was the Grodin photo, if I'm not mistaken, Corey, that they originally had
well, originally they were using the Zapruder film as timestamps, and I don't like to use the Zapruder film for reference for anything because it's clearly been tampered with, so we really can't say for sure. But initially, if you look at the film, it appears as though there's a gap of about 1.5 seconds between when John Connally is hit and when Kennedy is hit. So Kennedy is hit, and then John Connally starts to turn around, which he wouldn't be able to do if he was hit. And as he's turning around to look back, he looks back, starts to look forward, and then he's struck. And so another point of contention is that the entire time he held on to his big Stetson hat with his right hand. And if he had been struck in the right wrist at the time when they said they would, he wouldn't have been able to hold on to that hat throughout the Zapruder film, as is indicated there. But like I said, the Zapruder film is definitely tampered with. But either way, the story doesn't make sense. Anyone who's ever had any experience firing a rifle knows that even if you're shooting into cotton wadding, you're going to get some major damage to a bullet. It's going to be all kinds of distorted. You're not going to get a pristine bullet, which is what they ended up with at Parkland Hospital.
So chat, does that make sense, by the way, guys? How I demonstrated? Give me ones in the chat that made sense, how I showed you guys like the official narratives, take on how the bullet went through in the trajectory. That's what they officially say. Kennedy was off to the side, bullet went through him. That one bullet caused 7 different wounds between Kennedy and the governor. So again, I'm not saying that's what happened, but that's the official narrative. Does that make sense? That's why I had to kind of illustrate it for you guys physically, because it's very difficult to explain just speaking. Go ahead.
And then the second shot is it misses entirely, right? So it hits the curb, and a piece of the concrete flies up and hits a bystander, a guy who's standing underneath the overpass named James Tague. So what the government had to do was they had to, and then the third shot obviously takes off Kennedy's head. So they needed to account for all injuries using 2 bullets. That's how they came up with the magic bullet, because it was clear the final headshot was a single bullet that hit his head and nothing else. And so they had no choice but to attribute all the wounds on Kennedy to a single bullet. And that's also why the story came about in the first place. If you look at the, and I know you don't like to use this Zapruder film, but when he gets hit, it goes back into the left, right? So it's like, wouldn't that be indicative of being shot from the front versus being the back, even though the official narrative says all the shots came from the back? Yes, it would. That's exactly how everyone interpreted it. The first time the Zapruder film was actually seen was at the trial of Clay Shaw, and then it was again seen on Geraldo's show in the 70s. And the entire country knew that there was a shooter on the knoll as soon as they saw that. Can you tell real quick, because I think it's important that we mention this, who is Clay Shaw and who is Jim Garrison real fast? Okay, because that covers the other portion, because we got the Warren Commission, and then we have the Jim Garrison investigation. Right. So in 1967, Jim Garrison, who is the district attorney of New Orleans, he realizes that after reading the Warren Commission report that there's much more to the story, and that since Lee Oswald and all of these guys, Clay Shaw, who will end up being arrested and the only person ever put on trial for conspiring to kill John Kennedy, all of these guys, he already knew who they were, and so he took it upon himself to launch an investigation. Now, he keeps it under wraps for quite some time, but eventually the feds figure out what he's doing, and they go out of their way to sabotage his investigation. And I would say, historically speaking, I have read all the Garrison files. There's a couple thousand pages. There should be a couple 100,000 pages. I believe that somewhere around 80 to 90% of Jim Garrison's files have been destroyed. And so there was a clear effort to squash his investigation, and for very good reason, because his conclusions clearly draw distinction from the Warren Commission and show that the Warren Commission was a cover-up from the start.
Okay. And can you tell the audience real quick who Clay Shaw is?
Yes. So Clay Shaw, fascinating individual. Clay Shaw ultimately is a CIA agent. He worked under General Charles Thrasher during World War II in the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was the predecessor agency to the CIA, right? It was the CIA before the CIA.
And this is Jim Garrison right here, guys, a photo of him just so you guys see. And then we'll pull up a picture of Clay Shaw. Jim Garrison, he was the district attorney out of New Orleans. He was the only prosecutor, like Cory said, to bring a criminal case against anyone involved in the JFK murder. This book, his efforts were, famously documented in the movie JFK by Oliver Stone, which we're going to talk about why that movie got a lot of things wrong. However, it at least opened the door for people to see that there's a high likelihood Oswald wasn't the only shooter, and he went after a guy named Clay Shaw after he failed to go after someone named David Ferrie, which we're going to talk about him as well. Can we just pull up Clay real fast, Bills? And again, guys, we're going over the official narrative first, and we're going to go over the other stuff because I want you guys to really understand what they said happened, and then we're going to go over the other stuff so it makes more sense. Sorry, Cory, you were saying something. You were speaking about Clay Shaw.
Yeah. So Clay Shaw, after World War II, he engages in international trade, particularly dealing with Latin America, and he is a flaming homosexual.
Yeah.
That is relevant because all of these guys down in New Orleans who are connected to the assassination were recruited by the CIA, most likely because they were homosexuals, because back then they believed that homosexuals were much more easy to recruit and manipulate and ultimately blackmail if they needed to. So that's why they recruited so many of these guys in the first place. And this all becomes relevant because of some of the parties that go on in New Orleans that Oswald is allegedly seen at. But Clay Shaw ultimately is a CIA agent. He is working with international spooks from the Mossad, from France, from the Corsican Mafia, from the U.S. Mafia. I mean, he's really in bed with a different cut of people, all through his intelligence connections. And at the time of the assassination, he is the head of what's called the International Trade Mart. And the International Trade Mart in New Orleans had a sister organization in Dallas where Kennedy was actually going to speak. He was on his way to the Trade Mart in Dallas when he was assassinated. And that building and organization that ran that was the same organization that ran the Trade Mart in New Orleans. And that is this kind of conglomerate of Mossad and CIA agents. So the intelligence connections to New Orleans ran really deep. And when you start to get into our cast of characters, as I like to call them, and the handlers behind them, what you'll find is that they picked a slew of guys for this assassination who were, for the most part, already involved in Latin American affairs, involved in the Bay of Pigs, involved in other mercenary type activities. And so that's why New Orleans is so important, because many of the guys who they recruited for the assassination had already been long-term CIA who had been doing other operations, and they just kind of repurposed them because they had them available. So
now, I guess if we're going to talk about Jim Garrison, Clay Shaw, we have to mention David Ferrie.
Yes.
Can you please explain to the audience who David Ferrie is and how he also ties into this? And we're going to talk a lot more about David Ferrie when we go over like what really went down, guys. But we're still covering the official narrative and the movie in general, which kind of loosely touches with the official narrative. But can you explain who he is? Can we pull up a photo of him real quick too, Bills, for the audience?
So David Ferrie is probably the single most important person in the assassination, at least in as far as Jim Garrison's investigation went. He was when you look at his background, he was a former priest who had been defrocked because he was gay and he was a pedo, so they kicked him out. And that kind of haunted him for life. And one thing about David Ferrie is that he was a pilot, and he was used by the CIA very frequently for trips to Cuba and Venezuela and South America. David Ferrie also happened to work for Carlos Marcello was the mob boss of New Orleans, one of those top 3 mob bosses in the country. And so David Ferrie was deeply connected with the CIA, the mafia, and you'll find other interests that he was connected to through his relationship with Clay Shaw. But of course, the official story denies that Clay Shaw and David Ferrie ever knew each other. And they have to maintain that myth in order to maintain plausible deniability. And I got to take a moment and address something. Plausible deniability is the single most important concept that you can grasp when it comes to the Kennedy assassination. Every story you've been told by the government about what happened with Kennedy is simply nothing more than a story to allow the Central Intelligence Agency to maintain plausible deniability. And plausible deniability is basically a reasonably believable story that would give you an alibi or an excuse or a reason why you weren't involved in something, right? Oh, I couldn't have done it because I was doing this over here, or it wasn't my name on that document, it was this guy's name, even though that's just an alias, right? So plausible deniability was a way for the government to deny that they were involved in a specific action. And that is basically why all the lies have been created in the first place, and why the setup of Oswald will happen. And it is all about plausible deniability. And so another concept you really need to grasp in regards to the lies that we've been told about the assassination, or you have to understand the concept of psychological warfare. Every time the government lies to you, they're committing an act of psychological warfare against you. And that is basically a way for them to manipulate large-scale populations to get a particular outcome, or to get people to believe a certain thing to go along with certain behaviors, right? And so those 2 concepts are extremely important in understanding. Once we transition from official story, which is pretty easy to grasp, to the real story, you will see the plausible deniability fall away. So sorry about that. I had to clarify that.
No. That's extremely important because it's setting the stage for everything else to make sense. And just so you guys are wondering, we are going to switch to Rumble here pretty soon once we get into what the hell really happened. Obviously, and I'll summarize real fast the official. Oh, the other thing too, real fast, because a lot of people say this, we might as well debunk it. A lot of people say Lyndon B. Johnson was behind Kennedy being killed. Can you give us your take on that real quick? And for those that are wondering, Lyndon B. Johnson was the vice president at the time. He was sworn in on November 22nd, 1963, a few hours actually after Kennedy was killed. Not even a few, maybe like literally right there. I know they brought a judge in. They swore him in on Air Force One. Jackie Kennedy is there right next to him with her blood-stained outfit, still, obviously still grieving from her husband being killed in front of her.
Correct.
And what's correct?
Correct. Like it was a few hours after.
Yeah, a few hours. Okay, so and a lot of people try to say, oh, Lyndon B. Johnson was involved in that, in him being killed. What's your take on that?
So my take on that is that Johnson was not in the know. The primary reason is because I understand who Lyndon Johnson was. I know he never won a fair election. He basically was a puppet the entire time, his entire political career, despite the many books that were written about him and his, sharp decision-making, prowess. That guy was a puppet. And so he never did a thing that he wasn't told to do. And so I don't believe that at all. And one of the biggest incidents that occurred, well, for me at least, after the assassination on Air Force One, before he was sworn in, you have General Godfrey McHugh, who is Kennedy's military advisor. He's one of the first people to get back to Air Force One after Johnson, and he needs to talk to Johnson, and he can't find him. 15 minutes, he's looking for him on this airplane. He can't find him. He eventually finds him in a bathroom behind the president's office, and he's crouched down in the shower, and he's crying hysterically. And he says to McHugh, "It's a plot. It's a plot. They're going to get us all." So that doesn't sound like a guy who was in on the assassination. That sounds like a guy who's scared that he's next. So
wow.
I don't put any credence into anybody who says that Johnson was behind it, because There's zero evidence. It's an assumption. There is not a single. Well, this is weird. I guess this is a little off because Johnson's men surrounding Johnson were in on it for sure. But again, they were handlers. Johnson's men who were supposed to be working for him were handlers for intelligence. And therefore, I believe he was the last to know anything, truly.
Do you think that is why he ended up, bending over backwards and just kind of going with the flow once he established presidency? He repealed a bunch of the things that Kennedy had tried to put in place. He pretty much, aligned with a certain nation that we'll talk about more in detail on Rumble once he took presidency.
Right.
Do you think that's his fear is what led him to be so compliant with the other powers that be?
No, I think the powers that be put him in that position, and he was ideologically aligned. And you have to think, back in 1963, Southern Democrats were really Republicans by today's standards. He was not a liberal by any stretch of the imagination. And so the idea that he would maintain any of Kennedy's policies, to me, is laughable. It's pretty clear he was going to rewrite everything once he got in. That's just me saying that from how I know Lyndon Johnson.
If I'm not mistaken, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, I think the only thing he stuck to that Kennedy tried to implement was the civil rights push that Kennedy tried out of respect for his legacy and by his brother pushing RFK, who was the attorney general at the time. That's the only thing that actually stood in Johnson's administration, correct?
Yes, but the civil rights movement wasn't what you think it was. And so we'll talk about that another time. But the actions that followed with the civil rights movement were not above board, if you ask me. And so, that's the only policy that I can mention, that I can even think of offhand. And I knew you were going to say it as soon as you started to. So yes, that's the only one I can think of.
Yeah, because he got rid of all the other stuff, especially the stuff that didn't benefit a certain state. So what I'll do is before we, what I'll do? I'll read the chats real quick. Then I'm going to summarize the official narrative. Then we're going to hop on Rumble.
Sure.
So let me, Bill. So do we have them ready or? If not, then I'll just start reading. So, guys, I'm going to summarize for you guys real quick the official narrative. The official narrative just goes down as this. On November 22nd, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, on or about 12:30, the allegation is that Lee Harvey Oswald shot John F. Kennedy from the back from the 6th floor of the book depository during Kennedy having a motorcade with Governor Connolly at the time. The official narrative says that only 3 shots were fired. The first shot missed, second shot hit 7 wounds, if I'm not mistaken, and the third shot was the fatal shot that hit him in the head, correct?
The first did all the wounds and the second missed.
Okay, second missed, then the third was the fatal.
Right.
And then they also say, and like you said before, Kennedy was on his way to deliver a speech at the Trade Mart with Connolly, and they took that specific route going around. And when Kennedy was shot, if I'm not mistaken, the vehicle slowed down to about 10 miles per hour when he was shot.
There's some contention over this, but yes, ultimately it did happen. There was some slowdown, but I think the slowdown was not so they could shoot him. It was for another reason, which we'll cover later.
Okay. And that's basically it, guys. And then, he was shot. They rushed him to the hospital. He was pretty much damn near pronounced dead at the scene. I know he got there. He was still alive. He had a pulse or whatever, but he was pretty much out of it. They administered the last rites, and he was dead by 12:45, 1 p.m. They announced it on the news.
Correct.
So, and then Lyndon B. Johnson, the vice president, was sworn in right after the fact, and that is pretty much the official narrative. Give me ones in the chat, guys, if that makes sense to y'all, because what we're going to go into is a lot more complex than that. But that is the official narrative. Oswald was a lone shooter. There was no conspiracy. He hated Kennedy. He was a traitor, a defector for the Soviet Union, which we talked about before. It doesn't make sense, guys, because we know his, Kennedy was actually, I don't want to say he was pro-communist, but he was pro-making peace with these individuals and getting rid of a hostile environment. So give me ones in the chat if that makes sense for you guys. Did I miss anything there, Cory, with the official narrative?
No, that sounds right.
And then we talked about Jim Garrison real fast. So Jim Garrison was the prosecutor out of the state. He was the attorney, the district attorney for the which is the highest prosecutor in New Orleans. He had a nexus thanks to David Ferrie, Clay, and Oswald, all being from New Orleans. Okay, that's how he had his nexus. He went after David Ferrie first. David Ferrie died. They say that he died through natural causes, but there's a lot of allegations that he died through murder. That's irrelevant. But the point is that he was the main target of the investigation. Jim Garrison. He thought that Ferrie was one of the shooters. He ended up dying, so he couldn't prosecute him. So he went after Clay instead. As you guys know, Clay and Ferrie are both gay, working for the CIA. And that's how they compromised individuals. They had compromising photos, etc. Ferrie even had some inappropriate relationships with minors. And they ended up trying to prosecute Clay. I think it's important to also note to you guys that Clay was found innocent in the jury trial. They didn't deliberate for long. They returned a not guilty verdict, and Clay was able to walk. And Garrison ended up losing that situation. But there's two main files. There's the Garrison file and then the Warren Commission, which Garrison heavily opposed the Warren Commission and didn't believe it. And then, as a matter of fact, wasn't there another investigation done in the 70s, Cory, that found that it was probable that it was actually a conspiracy and there was more than one shooter?
Right, the House Committee on Assassinations, so the Select Committee on Assassinations. Yes, there are some amazing, fascinating documents. I cover them on my daily podcast, but the HSCA is how it's come to be known. They took the investigation to the next level. Not that they solved anything or ever had any intention of solving anything. They were sabotaged from the beginning. The lawyers who were running it were put in place to scuttle it. So they were fighting against themselves as the researchers were digging up information. It's really crazy. But some of the data that we got from the HSCA is just absolutely priceless.
Yeah. And that was, I would say, the first time that the government, outside of Jim Garrison, which was state government, it was the first time that the federal government acknowledged that it was a probable conspiracy with more than one shooter, correct?
Right, but the basis for their conclusion was solely an audio recording that was made from a left open microphone. I mean, the whole basis of the conclusion, I think, was it's so faulty. I want to call it fraud. So I would just disregard all the conclusions that all of these different organizations have made because none of them got it right.
Okay, all right, cool. So we went over the official narrative. We went over the Jim Garrison case. We showed you guys who some players are. Now we're going to go ahead and get into the second part. I'll read these chats, and then we'll get into and switch over to Rumble so you guys really know what the hell went down. What do we got here?
We're getting it right now.
All right, I'm going to read these chats real fast. Big W from Iron for speaking about this. Absolutely, Trayvon, we got y'all. There's no need to declassify those Trump documents because we're about to get you guys right now. Yo, Myron, do you use finasteride minoxidil for your hair growth? And if so, do you feel any side effects? Love from Norway. I just use the foam, guys. I don't use the finasteride anymore. I used to, but it has like negative side effects that I don't like. By the way, if you do need a general, where's it from? From LM. I don't know where you're at, brother. Let us know where you're from.
You said Norway, though.
Norway. Oh yeah, Norway. Okay. W. Cory, insufferable Dawson. It is what it is, guys. Is that it?
Yes.
Cool. So guys, come on over to Rumble right now. Don't worry, we're not going to take this to Council Club. This is going to stay all on Rumble, completely free, because this is important history that you guys all need to know. So come on over to Rumble, rumble.com/freshfit. Bills, tell me when we're clear, and then we're going to get into what really went down. We actually have a PowerPoint presentation to share with you guys, and Cory's going to go through it. So yeah, we could stay on